At my son's company ceremony, I noticed the way my daughter-in-law said my name. Not warmly, not proudly, but like it didn't quite belong there. She's from a different generation. She laughed into the microphone, her voice carrying across the ballroom. Back when business meant baking cookies for the PDA instead of building companies. The room responded with polite laughter. Not cruel, not loud, just enough. I smiled. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me what city you're listening from. I've learned that stories like mine travel farther than we ever expect. The Grand Meridian Hotel had never looked more impressive. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above round tables draped in ivory linen. Gold-trimmed place cards marked the seats of investors, executives, city officials. My son's company logo glowed softly on two massive LED screens flanking the stage. 15 years of innovation. That's what the banner read. 15 years. I had worn my navy blue suit for the occasion, the one tailored 5 years ago after I lost weight during a difficult winter. A single strand of pearls rested at my collarbone. Not flashy, just proper. My late husband used to say pearls were quiet confidence. I arrived 30 minutes early. I always do. Old habits from a lifetime of making sure everyone else was prepared. I sat in the second row, close enough to see my son clearly, far enough not to seem imposing. He looked so handsome on stage. Charcoal suit, silver tie, hair carefully styled. At 42, he had the posture of a man who believed the world had opened itself for him. And perhaps it had. He thanked his leadership team first, then the board, then his wife, Elise. She's been my rock, he said, smiling toward her table. The strategic mind behind so many of our expansions. Applause. Elise rose gracefully, one hand resting over her chest, accepting admiration as if she'd rehearsed it. I clapped too. Of course I did. Then came the moment. I suppose, Elise said as she joined him on stage for a brief speech of her own. We should acknowledge where it all started. She paused dramatically, with a very small loan and a lot of outdated advice. Light laughter rippled again. She turned her head slightly in my direction. My mother-in-law always believed stability was more important than risk, she continued. She didn't understand tech, or markets, or scaling, but she did make a wonderful pot roast. More laughter. Someone behind me murmured, savage. I felt the air shift. It wasn't what she said. It was how. The softness around the edges. The careful wrapping of insult and humor. The way she framed me as sweet, harmless, irrelevant. An artifact. I kept my smile steady. If you've lived long enough, you learn something about rooms like that. The people who laugh are rarely the cruelest ones. They're simply following momentum. My son chuckled lightly beside her. Not loudly, not maliciously, but he did not interrupt. He did not correct her. He did not say, my mother believed in me before any of you did. Instead, he adjusted the microphone and continued the program. And just like that, I understood something I had perhaps known for months. I was no longer part of the narrative. The ceremony moved on, slides of early office photos, employee testimonials, expansion milestones. They showed a photograph from the company's first year. My son in our garage, folding tables pushed together, extension cords running across the concrete floor. I recognized the space instantly. It was my garage. My dining room had served as their first meeting space. I brewed coffee for nervous 25-year-old software engineers who had no idea if their paychecks would clear. When the bank hesitated to approve the second line of credit, I refinanced my house. I never told anyone at the time. My husband and I had built that home over 30 years. But I believed in my son's idea, in his work ethic, in the way his eyes lit up when he talked about creating something of his own. That refinance check kept the company alive through its third year. There was no slide for that. No bullet point. No applause. Halfway through dessert, a delicate chocolate mousse served in glass cups, Elise leaned down from the aisle beside me. I hope you're not offended, she whispered with a practiced smile. You know it's just corporate humor. People love a generational contrast. Her perfume was expensive. Sharp. I met her eyes. I'm not offended, I said calmly. And I wasn't. Not in the way she expected. Offense implies surprise. This wasn't surprising. For the past 2 years, I had watched subtle shifts. Family dinners where I was no longer consulted. Holiday plans. Made without my input. Board announcements shared publicly before they were shared privately. Small things. Always small. That's how displacement works. By the time the awards were handed out, The applause felt distant. The room seemed louder than it had earlier, but I felt oddly still inside. After the ceremony, clusters of guests formed near the bar. Investors shook my son's hand. Cameras flashed. A local business magazine reporter requested an interview. I rose slowly and made my way toward the exit. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay for photographs. Near the coat check, an older gentleman cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Whitmore? I turned. He was perhaps in his late 60s. Conservative suit. Steel gray hair. I recognized him after a moment. Daniel Harper. The company's original legal advisor. He had been there in the early years. Before Elise. Before venture capital. Congratulations, he said quietly. For what? I asked. For staying composed. I gave a small smile. One learns. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. You should know, he said carefully. Your name still appears on more documents than people realize. I held his gaze. I'm aware. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Good, he replied. A beat passed between us. One of those silent understandings that don't require explanation. Enjoy the evening, I said. I suspect I will, he answered. Outside, the night air felt cooler than expected. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and walked toward the parking garage. My car, 10 years old, carefully maintained, sat under fluorescent light. Reliable. Paid off. I placed my purse on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it. Not anger. Not humiliation. Clarity. There's something freeing about being underestimated. They thought I was sentimental. They thought I was outdated. They thought I had faded into the background. But numbers do not fade. Contracts do not forget. And signatures, especially old ones, carry weight. I started the engine and drove home at exactly the speed limit. 2 weeks earlier, I had scheduled a quiet appointment. Not out of suspicion, out of preparation. When you reach a certain age, you learn not to wait until you're pushed. You step aside before the shove. As I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. The house looked peaceful. Familiar. Inside, I placed my pearls carefully back into their velvet box. Then I walked into my study. From the bottom drawer of my desk, I removed a folder. Thick. Organized. Labeled. I ran my fingers across the tab. Original shares. 15 years ago, when my son incorporated the company, he insisted on naming me a founding silent partner. At least on paper, Mom, he had said. You're part of this. Back then, it had felt symbolic. Now, it felt structural. I sat down and opened the folder. There are moments in life when silence is not weakness. It is strategy. At my son's company ceremony, they laughed politely. 2 weeks from now, we would sit around a very different table. And this time, I would be the one speaking softly. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the television. The house was quiet in a way that felt honest. No applause. No polite laughter. No carefully packaged jokes disguised as gratitude. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock in the hallway. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the way I always do when I need to think clearly. 1 tea bag. 8 ounces of hot water. No sugar. I sat at the kitchen table and replayed the evening in my mind. Not emotionally, but factually. The wording. The timing. The way Elise positioned the narrative. She didn't understand business. That line had not been spontaneous. It had been rehearsed. Framed to elevate herself while shrinking me. Gently, publicly, permanently. And my son, he had let it land. I don't believe he meant harm. That's the difficult part. Harm delivered casually is often more revealing than harm delivered with intention. I carried my tea into the study and opened the folder again. Original incorporation documents. Stock certificates. Board resolutions from the first 3 years. Back when the company operated out of my garage, my son insisted on allocating me a founding equity position. 25%. Non-voting at the time, because there was nothing to vote on, but fully vested. Just in case, he had said. Most mothers would have dismissed it as symbolic. I did not. Over the years, additional shares were issued to investors. Dilution happens. Growth requires it. But what Elise never bothered to calculate, what she never thought to verify before making me the evening's punchline, was that I had participated in every major funding round. Quietly. When the Series A required matching capital, I contributed through a trust my late husband had established. When the expansion into Texas stretched cash flow thin, I extended a private bridge loan at below-market interest. Not because I needed recognition, because I believed in stability. The same outdated advice she laughed about. I pulled out the most recent shareholder summary Daniel Harper had mailed me 6 months ago. I had skimmed it then, filed it carefully. Tonight, I read every line. Even after dilution, I remained the second largest individual shareholder. Second, behind my son. Elise's name appeared only through marital association. Interesting. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. Public humiliation thrives on imbalance, on the assumption that one person holds the microphone and the other holds nothing. But I was not holding nothing. I was holding paper. And paper, in the right room, carries more weight than laughter. 2 weeks from now, there would be a quarterly board meeting. Routine. Predictable. I reached for my phone and drafted a short email to Daniel. Please confirm my attendance at the upcoming board meeting. I have several items to review. I did not add emotion. I did not reference the ceremony. Strategy does not announce itself. I pressed send, finished my tea, and turned off the lights. Upstairs, as I removed my pearls and placed them back in their velvet case, I caught my reflection in the mirror. 70 years old. Silver hair neatly pinned. Calm eyes. Elise believed generational contrast made good corporate humor. She was about to discover it also makes very good leverage. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. I've always been an early riser. Habit from years of packing school lunches, ironing uniforms, and later, brewing coffee for a handful of young men who believed they were about to change the world from my garage. I made oatmeal, half a cup of rolled oats, a handful of blueberries. Nothing extravagant. Stability, as Elise would say. After breakfast, I walked into my study again. Not out of panic, not out of obsession, out of discipline. If I was going to attend that board meeting, I would not attend it emotionally. I would attend it informed. I pulled up the company's most recent public filings. Revenue growth looked strong on the surface. Expansion into 2 new states. A pending acquisition rumored in the business press. But growth has a cost. Cash burn. Debt exposure. Equity restructuring. I noticed something interesting in the footnotes of the quarterly summary Daniel had mailed months ago. A proposed restructuring of voting shares. Subtle language. Easy to overlook. Conversion of select Class B shares contingent upon board approval. I read it twice. My shares. Original Class B, non-voting at inception, yes. But convertible under specific conditions. Conditions that required unanimous early shareholder consent. I leaned back slowly. No one had approached me about conversion. No one had requested consent, which meant one of 2 things. Either they assumed I wouldn't read the documents, or they assumed I wouldn't understand them. Both assumptions were convenient. I opened a separate folder, the trust documents my late husband had established before he passed. He was an accountant. Methodical. Precise. Before he died, he told me one thing. Never sign anything you haven't read twice. I've lived by that rule. Inside the trust agreement was a clause referencing any equity participation in family enterprises. Protective language. Simple but firm. In the event of material structural changes, beneficiary approval required. Beneficiary. That would be me. I closed the folder carefully. The more I reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. Elise had been increasing her visibility within the company, speaking at events, sitting in on investor calls, presenting strategic forecasts. Visibility creates perception. Perception creates influence. Influence, if unchecked, reshapes ownership. I thought back to the ceremony. Outdated advice. That wasn't just humor. It was positioning. A gentle rewriting of history. If the founder's mother was merely sentimental and naive, then her role in the company could quietly be reduced. People accept revision when it's wrapped in applause. But paper does not applaud. By late afternoon, Daniel responded to my email. Your attendance has been confirmed. Agenda attached. I opened the attachment. Item 4 caught my attention immediately. Proposal, Equity Realignment Strategy. There it was. No mention of my name. Of course not. I stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. 6 ounces. Cold. I took a slow sip and stared out the window at the maple tree in the backyard. My husband planted it 25 years ago. It started thin and fragile. Now its roots run deep. Growth is not the same as replacement. 2 weeks ago, they laughed politely. In 10 days, they would sit at a long conference table with polished wood and filtered light. They would expect routine approval. They would expect silence. What they would not expect is participation. And participation, when supported by documentation, changes the tone of a room very quickly. For the next few days, I said nothing. That was the hardest part. On Sunday, my son and Elise came over for dinner. As if nothing had shifted. As if the ceremony had been a harmless evening of celebration. I made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed green beans. Simple food. Familiar food. Elise complimented the table setting. "You always make everything look so traditional," she said with a small smile. Traditional. Another soft word. My son talked about expansion plans. A potential partnership in California. Increased investor interest. His voice carried that same confident rhythm I'd heard on stage. I listened. Asked measured questions. "What will the equity restructuring mean for early shareholders?" I asked lightly, as I poured iced tea into his glass. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Oh, it's mostly administrative," he said. "Cleaning up classes of stock. Simplifying governance." "Does it require unanimous approval?" I asked. He blinked. I'd have to check the exact language." Elise jumped in quickly. "It's standard, Mom. Just modernization. You wouldn't be affected." "Wouldn't be affected." I nodded slowly and passed the green beans. Dinner continued. Safe topics. Weather. Traffic. A charity gala Elise was organizing. But something subtle had shifted. My son avoided meeting my eyes for too long. Not guilt. Uncertainty. After they left, I cleared the plates and washed them by hand. I've always preferred that to the dishwasher. You feel the temperature. You control the pace. As warm water ran over porcelain, I remembered the first year of the company. My son had nearly quit. Investors had pulled out. Payroll was tight. He stood in this very kitchen at midnight, hands in his hair, saying, "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." I didn't give him a lecture. I wrote a check. I co-signed a line of credit. I told him, business isn't about speed. It's about endurance. Outdated advice. Perhaps. But endurance builds roots. The following afternoon, Daniel called. "Have you reviewed the proposal?" he asked. "I have." "And?" "There are conditions," I replied calmly. "Conversion of Class B shares requires consent." "Yes," he said quietly. "It does." "And if consent is withheld?" "The restructuring cannot proceed as drafted." Silence lingered between us. "Are you planning to withhold?" he asked carefully. "I'm planning to attend," I said. That was enough. Later that evening, I opened my email and drafted a short message to the board secretary. "Please add the following to the agenda under item 4. Clarification of founding shareholder rights." No accusation. No emotion. Just clarification. I pressed send. The next morning, Elise texted me. "Looking forward to the board meeting. It'll be exciting to see the company step into its next phase." Exciting. I stared at the message for a moment before replying. "I agree. Growth requires careful alignment." She responded with a smile emoji. Alignment. That's the word people use when they assume everyone is already positioned the way they prefer. In 3 days, we would sit around that long polished table. They expected routine approval. They expected gratitude. They expected quiet. What they did not expect was a 70-year-old woman who had read every line. And I have learned something over the years. People laugh at tradition. They rarely prepare for it. The morning of the board meeting arrived quietly. No dramatic music. No storm outside the window. Just a clear sky and 62-degree air drifting through the kitchen screen. I dressed carefully. Gray suit this time. Structured. Professional. The kind I used to wear when meeting with bank officers 15 years ago. Low heels. Hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck. No pearls today. I wasn't attending as someone's mother. I was attending as a shareholder. The company headquarters had moved twice since the garage days. Now it occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building downtown. Polished lobby. Security desk. Digital directory. When I gave my name, the receptionist hesitated for half a second. Then her posture straightened. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. They're expecting you." Yes, they were. The boardroom sat at the end of a long hallway lined with framed growth charts and press features. Elise's photo appeared in several of them. Keynote speaker, strategic advisor, industry panelist. Visibility. Inside the conference room, 12 leather chairs surrounded a long walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A carafe of water sat near the center. Notepads placed precisely at each seat. My son stood near the screen, speaking quietly with two board members. Elise sat already, tablet open, reviewing slides. When I entered, conversation paused, just slightly, then resumed. "Mom," my son said, offering a quick smile. "Glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. I took a seat halfway down the table. Not at the head, not at the end. Position matters. The meeting began with standard reports, revenue updates, hiring projections, market expansion forecasts. I listened carefully, making small notes in the margin of the printed agenda Daniel had mailed me the night before. Item 4 arrived 40 minutes in. Equity realignment strategy, Elise announced smoothly, tapping her tablet to bring up the slide. Charts appeared on the screen. Simplified share classes, streamlined governance structure, attractive language, modernization, she said again. This will position us for future acquisition opportunities. She spoke confidently, practiced. When she finished, my son looked around the table. Any questions before we move to a vote? There it was. Routine. Predictable. I placed my pen down gently. Yes, I said. The room quieted in a way the ceremony ballroom never had. Before any vote, I continued calmly. I'd like clarification regarding the conversion of original Class B shares. A flicker crossed Elise's face. Daniel Harper, seated 3 chairs away, remained still. My son cleared his throat. It's mostly procedural. The incorporation documents specify unanimous founding shareholder consent for conversion, I said evenly. Has that consent been formally requested? Silence. Real silence this time. One of the external board members leaned forward. Is that accurate? Daniel adjusted his glasses. It is. The temperature of the room seemed to shift. Elise's smile tightened slightly. We assumed alignment, she said. Given that we're family. Alignment. I folded my hands on the table. Alignment requires communication, I replied. No raised voice. No accusation. Just fact. My son looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. We can table the vote, he said finally. A small sentence. A large correction. Around the table, pens shifted. Papers rustled. Investors recalculated quietly in their minds. Public laughter is easy. Boardroom reconsideration is quieter. And far more expensive. I did not need to say more. For now, participation was enough. No one rushed to fill the silence after my son tabled the vote. That was the first sign the balance had shifted. Board members who had been relaxed moments earlier were now flipping through printed packets. One of the investors adjusted his glasses and reread the shareholder summary. Elise closed her tablet slowly, the confident rhythm from earlier replaced with calculation. Daniel spoke carefully. Given the clarification raised, it would be prudent to conduct a full review of founding equity provisions before any restructuring proceeds. Prudent. A polite word for delayed. My son nodded. We'll schedule a follow-up session. I watched him then. Not as a mother. As a stakeholder. He looked unsettled, but not angry. There's a difference. Anger resists. Unsettled minds reconsider. The meeting continued, but the tone had changed. Questions became sharper. Projections were scrutinized. The acquisition timeline was pushed back, pending structural clarity. Clarity. It's interesting how often that word appears when money is involved. When the session adjourned, chairs slid back slowly instead of confidently. People gathered their notes with more attention than before. Elise approached me near the window. You could have discussed this privately, she said, keeping her voice low. I tried, I replied calmly. At dinner. Her jaw tightened slightly. We're trying to grow the company. And I'm trying to protect it, I said. Not confrontational. Just precise. My son joined us, hands in his pockets. Mom, why didn't you tell me you were concerned? I held his gaze. Because concern requires invitation. He didn't respond immediately. That pause mattered more than any apology would have. In the elevator down to the lobby, no one spoke. The mirrored walls reflected 3 versions of us. Executive, strategist, founder's mother. Roles shift. Ownership does not. Outside, the afternoon sun was brighter than it had been that morning. I walked toward my car without hurry. Halfway across the parking lot, my phone vibrated. An email from Daniel. Given today's developments, several board members have requested a comprehensive review of early funding contributions. Your documentation will be relevant. Relevant. I smiled slightly. For 15 years, I had kept every wire transfer confirmation, every promissory note, every signed amendment. Not because I anticipated conflict, because discipline builds quiet strength. When I reached home, I placed my keys in the bowl by the door and walked directly to my study. I opened the folder again, but this time I added a second one beside it. Bank records, refinancing paperwork from the year I leveraged my home to stabilize payroll. I laid the documents side by side on the desk. Contribution, risk, endurance. Words rarely spoken at ceremonies. That evening my son called. His voice was different, less polished. I didn't realize you still held that much equity, he admitted. I never hid it, I said gently. A long exhale came through the line. Elise thought consolidation would make us more attractive to buyers. Perhaps, I replied. But attractiveness without stability collapses under pressure. Silence again. Not hostile. Reflective. I don't want this to turn into a fight, he said finally. It isn't, I answered. It's governance. There's a difference between confrontation and correction. At the ceremony, they laughed politely. In the boardroom, they recalculated. Now, the real conversation was beginning. Not about generational contrast, but about ownership, responsibility, and who truly built the foundation beneath the glass building downtown. And foundations, when tested, reveal exactly where the strength has always been. The days after the board meeting were quieter than I expected. No dramatic confrontations. No angry emails. Just a subtle shift in tone. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a formal request from the board secretary for documentation of my early financial contributions. Professional wording. Neutral language. Attached was a note from one of the external directors. In light of recent governance questions, we would appreciate a historical overview of founding capital sources. Historical overview. That's how institutions ask for truth without admitting they overlooked it. I spent the next morning organizing everything chronologically. Year 1 garage phase. Personal savings transfer, $42,000. Year 2, payroll shortage. Home equity refinance, $180,000 line of credit. Year 3, bridge loan during failed investor round. Private note, $75,000 at 2% interest. Never fully repaid. Converted quietly into equity. I printed copies, placed them in labeled folders, and attached a simple cover sheet. No commentary, Daniel had advised. Let the numbers speak. So I did. Meanwhile, something else was happening. My son began calling more frequently. Not about family dinners. Not about holidays. About projections. About risk exposure. About board expectations. He asked thoughtful questions now. Did we move too fast on the restructuring? Were there early clauses I overlooked? He wasn't defensive. He was recalibrating. On Friday evening, he stopped by unexpectedly. Alone. No Elise. He stood in the doorway for a moment like he used to when he was younger. Uncertain, but trying to appear composed. Can I come in? He asked. Of course. We sat at the kitchen table where so many earlier decisions had been made. I didn't realize how much you put in, he said quietly. I didn't need you to, I replied. He ran a hand through his hair. Elise thought streamlining equity would strengthen valuation. Investors like simplicity. Investors like predictability more, I said gently. And predictability requires honoring original agreements. He nodded slowly. I never meant to erase you, he said. Erase. Interesting word. You didn't, I answered. You just stopped seeing the structure. He looked down at the table. I let her handle most of the governance discussions. I noticed. No accusation. Just acknowledgement. After a long pause, he asked, Are you planning to block the restructuring entirely? I considered the question carefully. I'm planning to revise it, I said. There's a difference. Blocking is emotional. Revising is strategic. I don't want conflict, he said again. Then don't treat stability like an obstacle, I replied calmly. Outside, the sun was setting behind the maple tree in the yard, the one his father planted. Its branches now wider than the roofline. Growth doesn't mean cutting down what supported you. It means building around it. When he left that evening, something had shifted again. Not power. Recognition. At the ceremony, I had been framed as outdated. In the boardroom, I became relevant. Now, in my own kitchen, I was something else entirely. Necessary. And necessity, once understood, changes the tone of every future conversation. The following week, the board reconvened for what was labeled a governance clarification session. A softer title. A firmer purpose. This time, I arrived 5 minutes early, not 30. I no longer needed to prove punctuality. When I entered the conference room, printed copies of my documentation were already placed at each seat, neatly tabbed, highlighted where necessary. No dramatics, just records. Daniel began the meeting. Before we revisit the equity proposal, we'll review founding capital contributions and applicable conversion clauses. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. One of the external directors flipped through the packet slowly. You personally refinanced your home? He asked, glancing up. Yes, I replied. And extended private bridge financing. Yes. And those amounts were converted into equity under the original shareholder agreement. Yes. Short answers. No storytelling. Across the table, Elise sat very still. Her tablet remained closed today. The director continued scanning the documents. These contributions materially impacted early survival risk. They did, Daniel confirmed. Another board member leaned back in his chair. Then any restructuring must account for proportional historical risk. Risk. That word carries weight in a room like that. My son sat quietly, reviewing the pages more carefully than he ever had before. Not because he doubted me, because he had never needed to see it line by line. Until now. After 40 minutes of review, Daniel turned to the agenda's revised proposal. Given the clarified capital structure, he said, the previous conversion model would disproportionately dilute founding non-voting equity. Silence. The kind that doesn't invite laughter. Elise finally spoke. We weren't trying to erase anyone, she said carefully. We were positioning for acquisition. And acquisition, one director replied evenly, requires clean governance. Clean does not mean convenient. I folded my hands and waited. This wasn't a courtroom. It was arithmetic. My son cleared his throat. What would a revised structure look like, he asked. Daniel slid a new document across the table. A dual-class preservation model. Conversion optional, not automatic. Founding shareholders retain protective provisions. Protective provisions. I watched Elise read the language. Slower this time. This changes valuation metrics, she said. It strengthens institutional confidence. Another director corrected gently. Different perspective. Different leverage. My son looked at me. Not defensively. Consulting. What do you think, he asked. For the first time in years, the question was direct. I think growth built on clarity lasts longer, I said. No lecture. Just fact. The vote that followed was not dramatic. No raised hands in defiance. No visible frustration. The revised structure passed unanimously. Unanimously. After the meeting adjourned, several directors approached me privately. Your documentation was thorough. Early risk often gets forgotten. Thank you for bringing transparency. Transparency. Interesting how quickly that word replaces outdated. As we exited the building, Elise walked beside me toward the elevator. I didn't realize how much of the foundation you carried, she said quietly. Most foundations aren't visible, I replied. The doors opened. We stepped inside. No tension, just recalibration. At my son's company ceremony, they laughed politely at generational contrast. 2 weeks later, the governance structure bore my signature, not as sentiment, not as symbolism. As protection, respect doesn't always return with applause. Sometimes it returns in clauses. And clauses, once written correctly, last longer than any joke told into a microphone. The week after the revised vote felt different inside the company. Not louder, more careful. I received a formal copy of the updated governance structure by certified mail. Heavy paper, clean formatting. My name printed under founding shareholder, protective class. Protective. I signed the acknowledgement copy and returned it without commentary. Meanwhile, something subtle was happening in the press. A business journal published a short article about the board's proactive governance refinement. No mention of internal tension. No hint of disagreement. Just language like strengthening long-term institutional confidence. Honoring original capital commitments. Interesting how truth becomes polished when it enters print. 3 days later, my son invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant near the office. Not a public celebration. Not a show. Just lunch. We sat by the window. He ordered grilled salmon. I ordered iced tea and a small salad. He looked older than he had at the ceremony. Not physically, just aware. I've been reviewing early projections, he said. Back when we were operating from your garage. I smiled slightly. Those were stressful months. I underestimated how much you carried, he admitted. I didn't carry it alone, I replied. Your father and I made that decision together. He nodded. Elise thought consolidation would streamline negotiations with potential buyers. And now? I asked gently. Now investors are more confident, he said. They see stability in preserved founding structure. Stability. The same word that had once been framed as limitation. He leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you ever remind me? He asked. Because respect isn't collected, I said. It's observed. He absorbed that quietly. Lunch ended without drama. No apology speeches. No emotional declarations. Just adjustment. Back at home, I noticed something else. My name had been added to the updated company website under Founding Contributors. A simple line. Margaret Whitmore, Early Capital Support and Advisory Contributor. No exaggeration. No flowery praise. Accurate. That evening, Elise called. Her voice was composed. I wanted to say, she began. I misjudged how visible your position still was. Visibility changes, I replied calmly. Ownership doesn't. There was a small pause. I never intended to make you feel irrelevant, she said. You didn't, I answered. You made an assumption. Assumptions are easier to correct than intentions. After we hung up, I walked into my study and closed the folder that had sat open on my desk for nearly 2 weeks. Documents returned to their drawer. Not hidden, just secured. At my son's company ceremony, I had been framed as generational contrast, a polite relic. In the boardroom, I became structural clarity. Now, quietly, I was something else. Integrated. Not because I demanded applause. Not because I raised my voice. But because I participated. Respect does not always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as a revision. And revisions, when properly signed, reshape the future without ever needing to shout. 2 weeks after the governance revision passed, the company hosted another event. Smaller this time. An investor roundtable. No chandeliers. No dramatic speeches. Just a private conference room, catered lunch, and serious faces. I wasn't originally on the invitation list. But this time, my name appeared on the agenda under Founding Shareholder, Strategic Perspective. Perspective. Interesting promotion for someone once described as outdated. My son had asked if I would attend. You don't have to speak, he said carefully. But it would mean something if you were there. I agreed. Not to reclaim space. To normalize it. The round table was quieter than the ceremony had been. Investors asked detailed questions about long-term risk exposure, board cohesion, and acquisition timing. One of them, a venture partner from Chicago, leaned back in his chair and asked, what safeguards exist to protect early governance stability during expansion? My son gestured slightly toward me. Founding shareholder provisions remain intact, he said. We've strengthened protective structures. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked confident. I added calmly, rapid growth requires patient oversight. That balance is built into the charter. No one laughed. No one shifted uncomfortably. They took notes. After the meeting, the Chicago investor approached me privately. Your early capital documentation was impressive, he said. Most startups don't preserve founding risk so clearly. It wasn't preservation, I replied. It was accountability. He smiled slightly. That's rare. Perhaps. Later that afternoon, as guests filtered out, Elise walked beside me toward the elevators. I've updated the next quarterly presentation, she said evenly. Founding capital contributions are now included in the company timeline. Included, I repeated. Yes. She hesitated. I should have done that sooner. I nodded once. Acknowledgement doesn't require ceremony. In the elevator, she added quietly, I focused too much on optics. Optics matter, I said. But foundations matter more. When I arrived home that evening, I didn't open the study drawer. I didn't review documents. For the first time in weeks, I made dinner without thinking about clauses or votes. Grilled vegetables. A small piece of chicken. A slice of bread. Simple. The next morning, the company's internal newsletter was sent to all employees. At the bottom of the email was a new section, honoring our foundations. A short paragraph detailing early financial risks taken by family supporters during the startup years. My name appeared, not as sentiment, as fact. At my son's company ceremony, I had been reduced to generational contrast, a punchline wrapped in politeness. Now, in official communications, I was positioned as structural origin. No confrontation, no dramatic reversal, just correction. That afternoon, my son called again. Thank you, he said simply. For what? I asked. for reminding me what we built this on. I looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree. Roots deep, branches wide. You didn't forget, I said gently. You just moved too fast. There's a difference. Public humiliation is loud. Restored balance is quiet. And when balance returns, it doesn't announce itself with applause. It settles, like a structure that has finally found its proper alignment. A month passed. No more jokes. No more subtle positioning. Just work. The acquisition talks that had once felt urgent were now unfolding more deliberately. Investors conducted deeper audits. Legal teams reviewed governance layers twice instead of once. Stability had become a selling point. One Thursday afternoon, my son asked if I would attend a final negotiation session with a potential buyer. Not to lead it, not to dominate it, to sit at the table. The conference room was different this time, smaller, more private. No skyline view, just a long polished table and serious faces on both sides. Across from us sat 3 representatives from a larger technology firm. Polite, analytical. One of them flipped through the governance summary and paused. Your founding shareholder protections are unusually intact for a company at this stage, he observed. Yes, my son replied. We chose not to compromise structural clarity. Chose. Interesting word. The executive nodded. It reduces internal volatility risk. That's reassuring. Reassuring. At my son's ceremony, I had been framed as outdated. Now, my presence was being described as reassuring. The negotiation moved forward smoothly. Valuation discussions were firm but respectful. No one questioned internal cohesion. No one raised concerns about board disputes. Because there were none. After the meeting ended, the executives shook hands and scheduled the next phase of due diligence. When the room cleared, my son remained seated for a moment. He looked at me across the table. I almost let momentum override structure, he admitted quietly. Momentum feels powerful, I said. Structure feels slow. He gave a small smile. I should have listened sooner. I didn't respond with forgiveness or correction. I simply gathered my notes. Outside, as we walked toward the parking lot, Elise joined us. She walked more carefully now, not guarded, just aware. The buyers specifically mentioned governance strength, she said. They said it gave them confidence. Confidence. The same room that once echoed with polite laughter now echoed with measured respect. I'm glad, I replied. She hesitated, then added. I was wrong to frame stability as limitation. I met her eyes. Experience isn't limitation, I said calmly. It's insurance. No bitterness. No victory speech. Just alignment. That evening, when I returned home, I didn't open any folders. I didn't check emails. I stood on the back porch for a few minutes, watching the wind move through the maple tree's branches. It stood firm, not because it grew quickly, but because it grew deliberately. At my son's company ceremony, my daughter-in-law mocked me in front of everyone for being outdated. They laughed politely. I smiled. Weeks later, in conference rooms and negotiation tables, those same qualities were being described with different words. Stable, protective, reassuring. I never demanded an apology. I never raised my voice. I simply participated. And participation, when supported by memory, documentation, and patience, has a way of reshaping the narrative without ever needing to fight for it. The ceremony lasted one evening. The structure we preserved will last far longer. The acquisition closed 3 months later. Not in a dramatic press conference. Not with flashing cameras. Just a signed agreement, a structured transition plan, and a board resolution passed without resistance. The valuation was strong. Higher than the initial projection before the restructuring attempt. One of the buyers had said it plainly during final review. We're not just purchasing growth. We're purchasing governance discipline. Discipline. I remember sitting quietly at the edge of the long table when the final documents were signed. My son's hand was steady. Elise's expression focused. No tension. No performance. Just alignment. Afterward, there was a small reception in the office lounge. Nothing extravagant. Sparkling water. Light appetizers. A few congratulations exchanged in low voices. My son raised a glass briefly. To the people who built the foundation, he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His eyes met mine across the room, and this time there was no hesitation in them. Only recognition. Later that evening, when I returned home, I walked into my study one last time and opened the drawer that had held those folders. The documents were still there, neatly stacked. Quiet. I didn't remove them. I simply closed the drawer gently, not because the story was over, but because the lesson had settled. A week later, the company held an internal town hall meeting to announce the acquisition to employees. I watched the live stream from my kitchen table. My son spoke clearly about growth, opportunity, and long-term stability. He mentioned early risk, early belief, family support. No jokes, no generational contrast, just truth. After the broadcast ended, Elise sent me a short message. Thank you for standing steady. I read it twice before replying. Steady is rarely glamorous, but it lasts. That evening, I stood again on the back porch, looking at the maple tree. It had grown taller over the years, its trunk thicker than I remembered. Storms had bent its branches more than once, but it never snapped, because its roots were deep. At my son's company ceremony, my daughter-in-law mocked me in front of everyone for being outdated. They laughed. I smiled. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I protected the structure. Respect did not return in a grand apology. It returned in revised clauses, corrected timelines, and a seat at every table that mattered. And in the end, that was enough. Sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that never raises itself. It simply remains, rooted. And when the applause fades, what remains standing is not the loudest moment. It's the foundation.